Welcome back to our survey of Western history. We've been looking at the Middle Ages over the past few sessions, and I wanted to take a little bit of a parenthesis today and talk a bit about misconceptions that people have about the Middle Ages. I want to look specifically and more broadly at the way in which modern culture has shaped our understanding of the Middle Ages and how that can be both a good and a bad thing. Think, for example, the way in which a film like Monty Python and the Holy Grail has shaped the way that we've understood the Middle Ages. One of my favorite films, by the way, but it's certainly not history. So I'd like us to take a look a little bit at some of the misconceptions that we have and maybe try to fix those just a little bit. When we think about the Middle Ages, often what comes to mind is that this was a dark and barbaric period. If you look at the literature, if you look at films, if you look at modern misconceptions, even a film like Pulp Fiction had a reference to the Middle Ages as being barbaric. So if we think about the way in which we've understood the Middle Ages from a popular standpoint, the notion that it was dark and barbaric seems to come to the front. And I want to challenge that for just a moment here. I'd like to point us to something that is not exactly medieval. In fact, it's a little bit more modern. If we think of barbarism, let's think of something like this. This is an advertisement for African Americans dating, if you can see it at the bottom of this advertisement, from the 1850s. And it is selling human beings for $1,250. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at something like this, I think, well, this is barbaric. And yet this is not something that is associated with the Middle Ages. Here's another example. This is an image of soldiers coming home from the Western Front during World War I. And if you look at the casualties from World War I and World War II, they are quite staggering. 60 million casualties from World War II, 35 million casualties from World War I. These numbers are staggering. And of course, if you know anything about World War I and World War II, these were not medieval wars. These were wars that were fought in the early part of the 20th century. So, in other words, when you look at these two examples, the selling of human beings in the 1850s or the killing of millions and millions of people in the early part of the 20th century, the question that I think of is this what we think of as progress? Is this something that we think of as moving forward compared to the Middle Ages? In other words, what I'd like to get at here is often when we think about the Middle Ages or any historical event, we tend to look at it through the lens that the modern world, the world in which we are living, is the best world that we could possibly have. In other words, we've advanced morally, ethically, we've advanced in so many different ways that whenever we look at the past, we look through the lens of a kind of cultural snobbery, if you will. And I'd like us to maybe think twice a little bit about that. It could very well be that 1,000 years from now, when people look back on the modern world, that is the world of the 19th century or the world of the 20th century or even the early 21st century, that historians 1,000 years from now, look back on us and we are the ones who are barbaric. So it just helps to put us into perspective here a little bit about these perceptions that we often have about the past, whether it be the Middle Ages or frankly any other period in the recent past or the distant past. We often tend to judge those periods through a lens, as I said, of kind of cultural snobbery, and that we are superior, that we are modern, that we are the most advanced society in all of the world. And I think maybe we should perhaps approach these kinds of things with a little bit more humility. So, another misconception that we often find in popular literature and film is that the Middle Ages was dominated by a repressive and authoritative church. The image on the left is an image of Innocent III, one of the great high medieval popes. He ruled over the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. He was a canon lawyer. He was responsible for suppressing the Cathar or Albigensian heretics. He's a really good example of what people might look back on the Middle Ages and show forth as an example of this repressive and authoritative institution. After all, the Middle Ages is when we think of the Crusades, we think of the witch trials or the witch craze of the early modern period, or we think of the suppression of heresy. And even going into the early modern period with the Protestant Reformation, the image on the right presents an image of the Pope as the Antichrist. Although it's a little bit difficult to see here, you have the beast from hell sitting on an indulgence letter with a Bible in his hand, and the Pope is going into his mouth. And so it's very easy when you sort of put forth this idea that the church was this repressive and horrible institution dominated by these powerful popes who ran around persecuting everybody. It's easy to see how the church could become a target for hate, a target for ridicule, etc. And so this misconception about the Middle Ages was something that was pretty prominent. In addition to it being a barbaric period, this notion that the church was this repressive and authoritative institution was probably the second thing that people typically thought of when they thought of the Middle Ages. Now, what I'd like to do here is just to suggest something a little different. So all of us know who this guy is. This is Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler, of course, was not a medieval figure at all. He was a modern figure. And if we're going to talk about the authoritative church, that the Middle Ages was dominated by this repressive and authoritative church, we might want to take a look, just by way of comparison, at the modern world. What I have here is a list of the so-called bright modern period that's dominated not by a repressive and authoritative church, but by repressive and authoritative states. One way to measure this, of course, is just to look at the body bags. And, you can look at something like Soviet genocide under Stalin, where up to 50 million people lost their lives. Of course, the German Holocaust, 6 million. Chinese genocide under Mao, 50 million. I would argue legalized abortion since 1973. The millions and millions and millions of lives lost in the modern world by not a repressive and authoritative church, but by a repressive and authoritative state. Pol Pot in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, North Korea, Uganda. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So when you think about this concept of the Middle Ages as dominated by this repressive and authoritative church, I wonder, which would you prefer? To live under the repressive so-called and authoritative church of the Middle Ages, or the modern period dominated by repressive and authoritative states? I know what my answer would be. So let's look at a couple of misconceptions about the Middle Ages and correct them. First of all, what I would say here is that, yes, the church retained a sense of hierarchy in the Middle Ages, a chain of command, if you will. The church is a hierarchical institution. No question about that. It's always been that way since the very beginning, since its founding. So it retained that sense of hierarchy, and it also retained that sense of law over and against any tendencies toward autocratic despotism. In other words, the church retained a sense of what's right, and it had the authority to curb those autocratic despots that could have emerged in the Middle Ages but did not. The church, in fact, tempered the authority of the state. So this is not a period that was characterized by the separation of church and state, like what you have today. The church and state were deeply connected. They were two sides of the same coin, basically. So unlike today, where you have this separation of church and state, the Middle Ages, the church and state were together. And as such, the church had the ability to temper the authority of the state. The model here was Christ as the King of Kings who came to serve. And probably the best example of this is a guy like St. Louis IX, the 13th century king of France, who actually died on crusade. He was martyred. He's a saint. So he gave his life. And that's really the model in the Middle Ages of what a king should be. The king should be a servant, not an authoritative despot. And it had that ideal, it had that model, basically because of the church and the influences of the church. So yes, a hierarchy, yes, law, but that relationship between the church and the state tempered any dreams of autocratic despots like the Hitlers and the Maos and the Stalins of the Middle Ages. So that's an important point to appreciate. The other thing that I would highlight here about the Middle Ages is the church gave European society a theology of human value and dignity. In other words, it gave it the idea that the church, that human beings are made in the image of God. Now, this is something that the West in particular has taken a long time to fully understand and fully apply in our world. Again, we can reference colonial American chattel slavery, where human beings were hardly treated as created in the image of God. But nevertheless, that value and that ideal was always there, and that value and that ideal came from the church in the Middle Ages. So it was this idea that human beings have value, they have dignity, apart from their race, apart from their gender, apart from anything that you can think of. Okay, so this notion of the Imago Dei is really, really important, and it's something that comes to us from the church. Another element of this was that monks helped to make work sacred. This notion of ora et labora, prayer and work, you can find it on our college seal. Monks made work sacred. It was not something that was a chore. It was something that work was something that you did to the glory of God. It was a calling. It was a vocation. And monks helped to make that idea a prominent one. Remember, in monasteries were a deeply democratic society. People from all walks of life, all levels in society would come into a monastery and they would work. And often this would be agricultural work, or they'd be copying manuscripts or whatever it was. Monks had a way of showing that there was dignity, that there was honor in the work that we did as human beings. I would also mention that the church, and this is something that is often missed, but the church protected the rights of women. This is something that a misconception about the Middle Ages is that the church, because they didn't ordain women to the priesthood, and of course still don't, that women were oppressed by the church in the Middle Ages. And I would argue that it's important to remember that the church protected the rights of women. Probably the best example of this is in the 12th century, when the church made it a part of their canon law that in order for a marriage to be valid, a woman had to give consent to the marriage. In other words, a family couldn't simply ship their daughter off to someone to be married for political reasons and have that count as a valid marriage. So we have places in our world today where this sort of thing can happen, where people, you have arranged marriages and whatnot, and women can be sent off to be married against their will. The church protected the right of the woman to agree to the marriage, and without that agreement, the marriage would be invalid. The other thing that's important to keep in mind here as well in the Middle Ages is that although slavery was something that was definitely part of the ancient world, you see it in ancient Greece, you see it in ancient Rome, you certainly see it in the modern world. In the Middle Ages, slavery was not something that was common. Yes, there were serfs. The manorial system had serfs or peasants that worked the land, but these were not chattel slaves. That's an important thing to appreciate. Again, it goes back to this idea that human beings were made in the image of God, the imago Dei. But serfs were not slaves. They worked the land. They may have been lower on the totem pole, if you will, of society, but they were not slaves. So some of these things are really important to appreciate about the Middle Ages, things that we don't often remember when it comes to our misconceptions about the medieval past. Finally, I want to mention this too is another thing that we often forget about, is that in the Middle Ages, science, art, philosophy, literature, music, architecture, indeed culture in general, flourished. Now, this was particularly true in the High Middle Ages. In the late 11th and 12th and 13th century, you see this happening. But just think of the beauty of the Gothic cathedrals. Think of the philosophical work of someone like St. Thomas Aquinas. The literature, both sacred literature and also non-sacred, or what you might call secular literature. The music of the Middle Ages, just amazing stuff. And also science and art. Culture flourished in the Middle Ages in a way that we don't often appreciate when it comes to our typical modern understandings of the medieval past. I'd like to offer one other example of the way in which the modern world has a tendency to look into the past with a certain sense of cultural superiority or arrogance. What you have on the left-hand side of this page is the Grand Arch of Defense in Paris. This is a massive cube. The people at the bottom, the little dots at the bottom, are people climbing up the stairs of this thing. It's gigantic. It's a building that was built in the 1980s, commissioned by President Francois Mitterrand of France. And it was built as a monument to human rights. The French wanted to build a monument to human rights. And so rather than look to the building on the right, which of course is the famous Cathedral of Notre Dame, they decided to build this gigantic arch. And if you go there today, the tourist literature boasts that you can fit Notre Dame Cathedral inside this cube. And I don't doubt it. I mean, the thing is gigantic. It's impressive, though, not because of the complexity of the design. It is, after all, just a cube. And as a design, it has a rather cold and some might even say a fascist look to it. But it is big and it is impressive. But compared to the building on the right, I wonder if Paris really needed to have this monument to human rights, if in fact it didn't already have one right down the street on the Ile de la Cité, the famous Notre Dame Cathedral. If you go to Notre Dame Cathedral, it is one of the most beautiful examples of Gothic architecture in the world. The flying buttresses, the stained glass windows, the radiating chapels, the spire, the towers, all of the little nooks and crannies where Quasimodo used to live. It makes this building one of the most fascinating and complex buildings in the world. Visitors can spend days looking through the various nooks and crannies of this building and never quite plumb the depths of it. Gargoyles, statues, paintings, relics. It is just a marvel to look at. It strikes me as something of an arrogant posture, really, to suggest that all of the things that the church stood for in the Middle Ages, the protection of women's rights, the idea that we are created in the image of God, all of us, no matter race, color, ethnicity, however you slice and dice us, we are all created in the image of God, that there is nothing that highlights human rights more than what that church on the right-hand side stands for. So, to me, this is a good illustration of how it is that we sometimes look through the past through this particular lens that we modern people have all the answers. We're the best. Our culture is superior, more enlightened than any civilization in the past could possibly have been. And I think that's a mistake. Now, going back to the very beginning of this course, I often compare the study of history to our appreciation for our own family, grandma, grandpa, things like that. And I try to help students understand that they do appreciate, that they do love history, because of course they love their family and they love their grandparents and their great-grandparents. But you can see a little bit of this cultural superiority, this snobbery, if you will, when it comes to our interactions with older generations. Think for a moment about how you often interact with a grandparent, a great-grandparent, if you know them. We often look at people from the past again and say, well, poor old grandma or poor old grandpa, they don't have access to the internet, or they don't know how to use the iPhone, or they don't know how to do this or that, and it's usually related to technology. And so we tend to judge the people from the past, whether it be our relatives, our older relatives, or the distant past, like people who lived in the Middle Ages. And I think we need to have a bit more humility, a bit more caution in the way we approach the past. You might be surprised to know that people in the past had values that in some respects, are far superior to our own. So I hope this little parenthetical, if you will, this 20,000-foot look at the Middle Ages might help us to appreciate the Middle Ages a little bit more. When we get together next, we're going to take a look at one of the great advances, I think, in the Middle Ages, and that is the growth of medieval universities. So I hope you'll join us for that next. In the meantime, have a great day.